Today for the notes we're going to be looking at genetics in three different parts. The first part is we're going to talk about the father of genetics, Gregor Mendel. Then in the second part we're going to look at the three words traits, genes, and alleles and how those all work together. And then finally in the third part of today's lesson we're going to look at the different principles of dominant and recessive traits, as well as some of the other terms like phenotype, genotype, heterozygous, and homozygous. So for the first part, we're looking at Gregor Mendel, who is essentially the father of genetics. Now, the word that he kind of coined at the time, or that he's associated with a lot of the time, is the word heredity, which heredity, as our definition will say, is the passing of physical traits from one generation to the next, which means your parents' traits get passed on to you as their offspring, as their kid. So who was this Gregor Mendel character? Mendel wasn't actually a scientist at all. He was actually a priest, or to be more specific, a monk from Austria. He lived in a monastery. Those guys with the brown cloaks, had the cross-chain necklaces. And he was also a gardener for the monastery. And what he looked at and what he kind of experimented with, so to say, was pea plants, because that's one of the things that he ended up growing inside of his garden was pea plants. So his experiment was as follows. Essentially, what he ended up doing, and I got a picture here to show this. What he ended up doing was that the very first time he took a tall plant and mated it with a short plant. So over there on the one side is your tall plant and the other side is your short plant. So essentially we can think about this as like mom was tall, dad was short. What ended up happening was that all of the kids in the next generation here, just right in the middle there, they were all tall. So even though one of the parents was short for their plant height, it ended up creating all tall children out of it. And that puzzled him, because he thought it was going to be split down the middle, since half of them were tall, or dad was tall, mom was short. He figured that half of the characteristics, half of them would end up being tall and half of them ended up being short. But that wasn't the case. It ended up being that all of them were tall. So then he questioned this, and he decided to do another experiment. So what he did was that he took the second generation, the ones that were all tall, and he ended up mating them together. So he took basically the offspring and mated the offspring together. And what he ended up getting in that final bit was he ended up seeing that 3/4 of those new plants were tall, whereas there was 1/4 that was short. So the trait seemed to skip a generation. Now, it wasn't until later that we figured out why this is the case, and we'll look at why it is the case in a little bit when we get to further down in our notes. But what ended up happening, essentially, was that the trait kept on passing along, and it went along with the thoughts of dominance and recessive. One of the trait is dominant over the other, so it's going to show over the other one. The trait is going to be expressed, as we like to call it. In the second part, we're going to look at a couple of terms that are going to be used in genetics. The first thing that we need to describe, though, first is what is genetics. Genetics is the scientific study of heredity. And as we mentioned at the very beginning of these notes, heredity is the passing on of traits from one generation to another. So from parent to offspring, which could be something like hair color or eye color, which is something that's very commonly talked about when we're talking about genetics. Now, when talking about it, I've already used this word a couple of times, traits. And what is a trait? A trait is just a characteristic. And these characteristics can come in different shapes and sizes, such as hair color would be your trait. You could have brown hair, black hair, blonde hair, red hair, gray hair. You could have all different types of traits for the characteristics there. And that's what traits are, just different forms of a characteristic. Now, with these traits are controlled by something called a gene, and these genes are inside of our DNA. And what a gene is, that's G-E-N-E, not like jeans like you wear, but what a gene is that it's just something that controls the trait. Typically, it's our sequence of proteins, and that protein then goes on to code for that specific hair color or eye color or whatever it is. Along with the gene, there are different forms of genes. Now, these different forms of genes are called a specific term as well. The different forms of a gene is what's called an allele. That's an allele. And they're just different forms of a gene. So kind of like how we have different traits, we have different genes. Those different forms of genes are called alleles. Now, depending on the type of alleles that you have, there are two alleles that make up a gene. Because you get one allele from mom, one allele from dad. Those brought together end up making you. So you have two alleles that go into making up a gene. You get half your DNA from mom, half your DNA from dad. So there's two outcomes that we could have for our gene and allele combinations. You could either be a purebred, which is when you have the same trait. So you have two of the same types of alleles, such as, brown hair and brown hair. You got a brown hair from mom, you got a brown hair from dad. Both of them are alleles. They get passed on to you. You would be purebred for having brown hair. You could also be what's called a hybrid. This is where you have two different alleles for a trait. So you could have a blonde allele from mom and a brown allele from dad. Those would then come together. You would be a hybrid at that point because you have two different alleles in your gene. Now, depending on which allele is dominant over the other, depends on whether or not you would have either brown hair or blonde hair. Our final thing that we're going to look at today is the principle of dominance and recessiveness when it comes down to genes and traits. Now, the first thing that we need to understand is what dominant and recessive means. A dominant allele means that it is the allele that is going to show up. It's going to be the trait that takes charge when it's presented in itself. If you think of a dominant person, they're usually the ones that are stronger. That's kind of what it's like in our genes. We have an allele that is going to be stronger, quote unquote, than the other ones. And then we have our recessive alleles. Recessive alleles is a trait that is hidden whenever the dominant allele is present. So even if we have a recessive allele present in the gene, it's not going to be shown unless we have two recessives. Because remember, we have two alleles in each gene. Two types of words that go along with it. We have homozygous and we have heterozygous. Homozygous is we have two identical alleles for a trait. So it would be like having brown hair and brown hair alleles. Those go together, you'd be homozygous. Or you could have a blonde hair allele and another blonde hair allele. Those would end up being homozygous. It is the same thing as saying purebred. It's just in a more scientific fashion. Now there's another word called heterozygous. Heterozygous is where you have two different alleles. So that would be our case of our hybrid, where we have a brown hair allele and a blonde hair allele. Combine them together, that would be your hybrid, or what we call a heterozygous. The last two things are two words that kind of go along with our principles of dominance and recessives is our phenotype and our genotype. These are just two fancy scientific words for saying phenotype, which is going to be our physical appearance. So your phenotype would be like saying, what's your trait? Do you have brown hair? Do you have blonde hair? Do you have black hair? That is your phenotype. It is what we physically see. And they both start with PH. Physical phenotype. It's what you show as part of your traits. Your genotype, then, is what your actual genes tell you. And it's your allele combination. So are you homozygous for having brown hair? Are you homozygous for having blonde hair? Are you a heterozygous? Meaning you have two different alleles. That would be your genotype. That's what your actual genes go into telling you. Now, all of these are going to become important over the next couple of days as we talk more in depth about what some of these factors mean. Some of these words may not make sense to you right away. That is okay, because over the course of the next couple of days, hopefully they will be as we start moving on to Punnett squares and some of the other features that we're going to show over the next couple of days in class. Have a great and wonderful day.